Welcome to the home stretch of the course. Obviously, it's only a couple of weeks left. Get rid of the announcements. Today is the drop dead date for the assignment 2. If it's not done by midnight tonight, TFB, not my problem anymore. Unless you had a pre-arrangement with me, and then no, it's not TFB for you. As far as I know, there's only one student that made that pre-arrangement. Hybrid 4 to 7 is due tonight. Why? Because test 2 magically will appear in Blackboard for you guys at 4 o'clock. As soon as the lecture's done. Right? So I don't have people trying to do the test while I'm lecturing. I don't like that. And then until Wednesday, end of day. So that means you got 3 days to do the test. Stay home, same deal, same rules as last time. I put a drop dead date on it of, actually I'll write it down. Test 2 drops dead at midnight next Monday. Because by then you should be, that's not how you spell Monday, that's how you spell Monday. You should be concentrating not on this anymore, but getting ready for your finals as of Monday. That's why the drop dead, there's no more work being assigned. The last lab, everything will be assigned as of, starting next week. That lab, you've got weeks to do it. Your practical exam is apparently scheduled for next week. That is in lab. That was the consensus amongst 3 teachers. I got outvoted. We outvoted someone who wanted to have it this week. So I wanted it, 2 weeks from now. She wanted it this week, so we all agreed to meet somewhere in the middle. Essentially, if you are capable of achieving Lab 9, which is why you have this week to finish it, it's going to look a lot like Part 2 of Assignment 2. It's exactly the same format, except the questions are random. They are issued in lab. So you come into the lab. I will have a diagram up on the board, on the screen. There's a backup file you are to restore. Complete instructions will be provided. There are 10 questions you must answer. 3 are easy, 6 are medium, and 1 can make you want to cry. The actual decision on what the points are worth is still up in the air. It depends on how everybody handles it. At most, it's worth 10 points. If it gets really horrible, I might bell curve it, just to make life easier. Or I might drop some of the harder questions, depending on if everybody failed the question, therefore it was too hard, or I expected too much from you. I don't know which one it would be. We will see what the math is on that. There will be an attendance sheet. It's the first time you'll ever see one of those in one of my classes, and the last time you'll see one in one of my classes. Is you come in, if your lab period is, for example, 4 to 6 on Mondays. You're expected to come in and sign. If you submitted your test and you didn't sign that paper, I'm assuming you weren't sitting in class doing it. Which means that, you might have been sitting somewhere else and getting someone to help you. Therefore, you sign off. That'll be the proof that you were there. The only proof I'm going to use that you were there. Please remember to sign that piece of paper. I will make sure people, I'll write it big on the board so you're aware. Yes?
For the lab test there, do we have to go to our scheduled time?
Yes. Yes. Because the test is being released through Blackboard. I can't make it suddenly appear for 2 sessions at the same time, because then I could have everybody in that section magically getting a copy of the possible questions they're going to get. And the pools are a little bit different from one section to the other. They're mostly the same, but there may be the odd question that's not the same between sections. If I'd rather not have leakage. That's the only time I've required you to actually attend your own assigned lab. It's such as life. You've been given a week's warning, so if you have life obligations in that time frame, you have to make a choice. If it's the only class for that day, I'm sorry. Sucks for you. Come to class. Not much I can do. In this case, the only time, other than when you come to do the actual written exam. Obviously, I'm going to force the issue a little bit there. Obviously, because you're going to be writing it on a piece of paper. All right. What are we covering today? I'm going to cover triggers some more. And essentially, I'm going to go through a complete set of examples on what to do with triggers, what they can be used for, how they're used, how they're written. It's basically one giant demo class. I figure it's the easiest way to cover this material is doing it as a big giant demo class. That's what we're going to do. All right, so without further ado, I've created a fresh database. It's completely virgin. There's not even a table in it. Just so that, if you guys decide to follow along or you want to do this, you have to put up with my typos, obviously. But essentially, I'm going to start by creating a table, and I'm going to put some triggers on it and show you guys some of what happens. These are real-world examples. I've done similar things in existing databases elsewhere. So we're going to go with it. The first example I'm going to do is, in Canada, there's a law that has to do with, there's a law that has to do with whether or not you subscribe to an email, as into an email list. Are you subscribed to a given email list, yes or no? And the law states that we, as an employer or as a company, have to prove when you subscribe to a newsletter or when you unsubscribe for a newsletter. Because if you sent out an email to someone that has unsubscribed from your newsletter, and they can prove that they unsubscribed, then the fines are in the tens of thousands of dollars. Not on the first offense. The first one's a big slap on the wrist warning from the CRTC, and the second one's a fine. And then the fines grow exponentially after that, to the point where it becomes cripplingly expensive to screw up. Just going to kill the light or too much backlight. Now, I'm going to create a customers table. And I'm going to suck typing today, I can see it. Oh, it's going to be bad. I don't know why I'm typing horribly today. Oh. No, sometimes I feel I should have just written this completely out, just copy-pasted. Okay, by the way, I just broke the law. That default false, that's a no-no. So if you end up having a system where customers are allowed to opt out or opt in, by law, they have to actively choose to opt out or opt in. So that's a no-no, what I just did there, but I'll leave it like that for now because that's how it used to be written. All right, Ron and I got, of course, table, customers. My left hand's not keeping up with my right hand. That's not a good sign. That might be a problem. All right, I'm going to create another one called and And all right, so you can see this sort of mimics the customer's information. I've got the customer ID and I've got that bool for the opt-out. I'm going to hit run. Done. So now theoretically, I should have two tables. I'm going to go refresh this. Here's my two tables. All right, so when it comes to triggers in Postgres and Oracle, they behave similarly. Microsoft SQL Server now behaves like this. It didn't used to, but now it does, now that you can program using C#. It is a big believer in code reuse. Now, you guys should understand what code reuse is by now, right? You write a chunk of code and you reuse it as many places as you can so that if you need to fix a bug, you fix it in as few places as humanly possible. Databases, for example, like MySQL, when you create a trigger, it's attached to the table. With Postgres, you have to do two steps. You create a function, and then you create a trigger. The function is a special kind of function. It's called a trigger function. What makes it special? It returns a trigger to data type. So that means you can create a single trigger and attach it to multiple tables or multiple events. So that means, let's say you're keeping track of when somebody changes their email address, and you want to make sure that, let's say you have a table for customers and a table for dealers, and you want to keep track of when certain things change, so something like an opt-out log, as I'm about to do. You could write a single function that inserts into this log table, and then actually track when it happened, and just keep reusing the same function over and over and over again. You could do the same thing with inventory allocation, that kind of stuff. Next week I'll be doing a bigger example than this. But for today, I created the two tables. They're both empty at the moment. So if I go select star from customers, there should be nothing here. And I'm clicking on the wrong window. So it's an empty table. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to log the fact that every single time the opt-out field changes. Now, one of the things that changes is you need to track all the events. Whether somebody inserts, that means when they insert, you should log what the status was of opt-out so that you can go and keep the history of what happened to a given customer. So I'm going to call my function log opt-out. And you'll notice, I'm sorry, I was typing PHP for hours today, as I was throwing up curlies. It looks similar to the function I showed you guys last week, except it doesn't take any arguments. Trigger functions don't take arguments. There's no arguments whatsoever. But what it does, it returns trigger. In this case, it doesn't return a trigger object. It returns the data that a trigger would use. Trigger coming in, trigger coming out. Like that. And as always, I prepare my tags and everything so that I don't have to think about it. And then I'm going to, in this case, for this trigger, I don't need to declare any variables because I'm going to be manipulating the data that's coming in right off the bat. So I'm going to just do my begin and my end blocks, like such. So this is where all the magic's going to happen in here. So now I can do an if statement. And you have to be careful because you don't always have access to old. Because old does not always exist if you're doing an insert. So what you want to do is, some people once argued with me when I did this, said, well, you should log only when that status changes, which is true. There's a few ways of checking that. One is to check whether or not you're doing an insert. There's a way of checking for that. The other one is you can just assume that every single time something happens, you can go with it. And I'm just going to pull up my syntax here. Okay. Now, Postgres offers a bunch of different things when you're creating trigger functions. I'll just pull up the this documentation here for you guys. I'm just losing my mouse. There it goes. Hello. There we go. So when you're inside of a trigger, there's a few things it creates. There's new and old. I explained those last week. They're basically a list of the previous values. There's the name of the trigger that fired, so you can actually check which trigger fired. And you can also check when was this trigger fired. So you can say, well, did this happen before the insert or after the insert? Or before the update, after the update. There's a level, and there's the TG op. This is the one I'm going to play with. TG op, and it will tell me, insert, update, delete, or truncate. So it will tell me what kind of trigger just fired, so then I can code around it. So I'm going to go with update. And I can put in an else. All right, so what we can do is we can check whether or not this was an update as opposed to an insert. What do I want to check for that? If it's an insert, there's no old record. Therefore, I don't need to check whether or not the opt-out changed. I would just want to log it. Actually, I do want the else because I want to do this. And now I can go insert into, the heck did I call that table? Customer opt-out log? And I want to feed in the customer ID and the opt-out status. And because I know this is an insert, I can go, and I don't want to put that as a quote, that's stupid. And I go, all right, so I'm just going to go stand at the board for a second so I can point out what this is doing. Okay, insert statement you've seen before, and you see inserting in specific columns, but the values might look a little different to you guys. It's new and new. What this is doing is it's saying, okay, when I'm inserting, the new data is the customer ID and the opt-out, and it's in this special object called new. It's sort of like how you have a class with properties, and you have the different properties in it. It's the same thing. So picture that it's an object called new, and there's a property in it called customer ID. If you're dealing with the old data, the object would be called old with customer ID. All right, that's my insert statement if I'm doing something new. And I'm going to put an if statement in here. All right, so this is a really straightforward trigger. First of all, I'm checking to see if there's an update. It checks if the opt-out is there. It does an insert if it's an old one, if the opt-out status changed. You don't want to keep inserting records for an opt-out if the guy's just updating their phone number, but you want to keep track of when they opt-out and opt-in. All right, I'm going to hit run on this. Well, how much does anybody want to bet this isn't going to work on the first try? Let's be honest here. I don't think I've ever written anything that works on the first try. Everybody cross your fingers. It's actually not going to work because I didn't assign the trigger yet. So I've created a record in here. So there's my record. I wanted one in there and I would start with before anything happened. Now I'm going to create my trigger. I'm going to go top file. Okay, this is the syntax that you guys definitely haven't seen yet. What did I call it? Now, I'm going to create one after insert. Now, I'm going to explain to you why it's after insert. You want to create a logging function, but it only happens after insert for two reasons. One, you want to make sure the data gets applied to the database successfully. In other words, it passed any pre-checks. The parser and the database interpreter actually allow it to be written to the disk. And once everything succeeds, then you should log that it happened. Because if, for example, if it was a non-transactional database, like MySQL, and you issued the log statement first, you could log the fact that the person opted out, and then the actual insert fails. Suddenly you've got this nebulous piece of data that's not connected to anything. Or if it's after an update, if you do it before update, you could mark the fact the guy opted out, and then the update fails. But now we have a legal proof that the person opted out whether or not they did. Like they did, but it didn't successfully get into the database, so it's not valid data. All right, I'm going to create my trigger. And I got no errors that time either. I just want to get back to my insert statement here. And I'm going to create Dave at dave.com, and I'm going to run it. And now I've got an error message. Why? Because I screwed up my trigger. Level up. All right. I'm going to come here. Come back here. Hold on. And it's not customer ID, it's just straight up ID. Let's just show you guys error messages. Actually, believe it or not, I actually make mistakes on purpose. Sometimes, not always. But this one here, what it's telling you is record new has no field of customer ID. This is showing you that there's a record. You treat it like a record, but it's actually an object called new. And it's saying that new does not have customer ID. Why? Because I was inserting into customers. And customers doesn't have a field called customer ID. It has a field called ID. So this is an error message that shows when your code sucks. So now I fixed it. And this, don't forget, this is a create or replace. So it should just replace my function. I'll hit run. And reach the end because you need to return here. What happens in Java if you create a function that doesn't return anything?
In Java?
Yeah, and it's supposed to.
You get compile error, start screaming, probably crash your computer, 75.
Well, that's what this was. If you don't return something, it barfs. So let's try it one more time. All right. That time it worked. And if I go, by the way, I will be posting the functional version of this on Blackboard after we're done. From customers. So there's my two customers. And I go, there's the opt-out log. There's my record that I created. I did one insert 2 pieces of data. Now we'll do the insert again with another name so you can see the joy that it is. And this will be like that. I'm going to run it. And I've made it too long because the email address is too long. There we go. There's our 2 customer IDs, 4 and 5. Now you notice this is 4 and 5 because I got a couple of errors earlier with the inserts. And the sequence value had already been picked. 1 and 2 had already been picked, or actually 2 and 3 had been picked. However, there was an error in the trigger. That means that the sequence number was used and discarded. Because once it's been given, it can never be given again. And it won't roll it back in case somebody's now asked for the next one down. Let's say you got 2 transactions happening at the same time, but they take, say, a second and a half each, so one starts, say, half a second after the other. You know, the first one fails, the second one succeeded, but this one hasn't failed until this one already succeeded, so then somebody else asks for another number. You can't go and grab the one that from before because that's dangerous. You're starting to interweave data that should be interweaved.
So basically it's like a battery. Once it's out of juice, it can't be used again.
Yeah, pretty much. So now I'm going to check my updates. Update customers. Set opt out equal to true, where ID is equal to 4. And go.
Customers.
Yeah. Dan sucks at typing. There we go. This one didn't blow up. And now I do this. And it helps if I click the run button. And nothing happened. There's probably a reason for that.
Well, you always want to know about the updates.
Well, close. Logically, the code should work. He's on the right path. I only created one trigger. The trigger on the insert. Even though the code's handling the update, it hasn't been assigned to that. So it's a bit like how you have some Java code where you've written a class with some functions, and then you create a new object from that class. And then later down the code, you don't actually create that object again, but you're assuming it's there, and nothing happens because it doesn't exist. In this case, it's a fairly straightforward fix. Make sure you give it a different name. Otherwise, the database gets confused. I'm going to go go. So now I go back to my update statement. I go. I'm going to make it false because it should already be true. All right. Like this. All right, you can see me playing here with customer ID 4. It was marked false. It was marked true. If I go false again, when I run it, now you'll see it go true, true, false. And we know when it happened. We know that what the customer is. So in theory, if I want to prove whether or not what the last status of that customer was, we could write a simple if statement like this. I'm clicking in the wrong window. As of course it is. Okay. Now it shows the log of who was, what their status was at each given time. And you can do some fancy stuff with this also. Yeah, I could theoretically go so like this. So now I can sort based on the most recent entry. You should probably do it by date. So we can change this to log date. All right, so here's our log date sorted, reverse order. And let's say you want to just always have the last entry. Just make sure there's no noise. Especially when you're dealing with organizations like the CRTC, you don't want to give them extra noise. Why? Because they could see like 12 entries for a given customer depending on what they were doing, and it's changing, right? What you need to prove to them is what was the last thing they did. There's a keyword called limit. You tell it how many rows you want back. And if I go run with this, there's my last row. There. The last thing the customer did was he opted in because opt-out is false. Right? Opt-out true means no. Opt-out false means yes, please give me the email. So this is a complete set of functionality. I am just going to grab the little bits of code like this so that I can post it to Blackboard. Of course, it's now gone out of my buffer. This after insert. Okay, now that was version 1 of a trigger. This is called the login trigger. Did I tell you guys the story about serial number logging? No, probably not. Okay, a really good use of this kind of trigger is to log changes to things that shouldn't be changed often. As in things that are really important, such as serial numbers on products. We have a system where I work, for example, when somebody buys a piece of software, let's say dongleless software, so there's no hardware lock that ships with it, it authenticates against our server the first time it runs. And the system at that point does not have a serial number. The first time it runs, we receive a serial number that's generated based on the hardware of the computer, a bit like what makes Windows identify it's, your PC belongs to Windows by this magical key. Well, we do something similar. And then we take that number and we log into the database. Well, about 10 years ago, this code grew organically and is badly written. It's still badly written. It's just a lot better written than it was back then. But it's very badly written because it was written originally for one customer for use for 2 weeks. And then the sales rep sold it again. And again and again and again with no heads up as, Dan, you need to add some security to this. When do they need this code? Yesterday. Usual. I promised to them yesterday. Okay, when are you shipping it? Tomorrow. Okay, well, that's not going to get fixed today. So it grew organically every time, and it added features, and it got weirder and weirder. So we had this fellow who was showing up through a Tor node. I'm sure there's enough people in this room that know what a Tor node is. If you don't know what Tor is, you shouldn't be knowing what it is, unless you're going to security or you're pirating software. Or you're buying drugs illegally over the internet. Just saying, And by the way, the FBI and the CIA own all the Tor exit nodes in the U.S. So Tor is not safe. However, we had a fellow who was exiting through the Netherlands, a Tor node in the Netherlands, and he wrote a bot that was hitting our registration system, and he found how to exploit it. He was trying to figure out how to crack the encryption on our license files. So what he was doing is he was feeding known values into the serial number field, and he managed to find 3 products that actually matched, not the serial number, but the rest of the data was being passed in. He must have bought a copy of our software and Wiresharked the initial transaction. So then we started monitoring what he was doing. So he was actually changing the serial number over and over and over and over again, every couple of seconds, and retrieving a new license file because he was trying to find a pattern. Because that's how you crack encryption. You feed it a known string, you get a cipher coming back out, and you compare. Well, after I've patched it, and then 24 hours later, he found another hole. Then I patched it. 24 hours later, he found another hole. he and I played cat and mouse for about a month. I was getting really angry. A lot of rage because, 3 a.m. I was starting to get pages back when we had pagers. I still had a pager. Server paged me 2 a.m. Hacker intrusion. Because it put enough in there to capture what he was doing. Then I got tired and I wrote a trigger. It logged all the serial number changes. But Postgres has a cool feature where you can actually capture what the SQL command is that makes the change. I captured the change, captured the command, and I could grep. If those of you that don't know, it's a file search. I'm searching the internals of all the source code on the server the guy has access to find which file was being executed. File after file after file. Eventually, I won. But it took a while. Then I had to patch it again because he showed up 3 months later again. And this time he was using a buffer overflow to cause it to crash and execute SQL. I'm like, dude, you're spending way too much time on this. So in the end, we fixed that too. But
What software?
what that they were using?
Yeah.
I have no idea. He wrote a bot, but it was representing itself as just a web browser.
Yeah, what does your company sell?
We sell sign making software.
Okay.
It's a niche market. Imagine CorelDRAW plus AutoCAD able to drive printers that are 6 feet across.
Okay.
Those of you that are old enough to remember the old Air Canada planes had the Canada Goose across the back. That was a design for a while. Across the tail was the Canada Goose. Our software cut the vinyl that made the template for that. So if you look at all the stenciling on the side of the American tanks and planes, that's our software that cuts out all that vinyl. The American government buys a lot of our software. It's great. At least we know we have somebody who's going to keep giving us money. But that's an example, right? So our software sells from anywhere from $600 to $3,000, depending what you're buying. So it was worth his time to try to crack it. So then he could sell cracked copies for $50 a pop. He didn't crack it. Not that we found it anyways. So that's why that's what login triggers are for. There's another kind of trigger that you can use, and that's for data validation. Let's say you want to make sure that people don't put in certain things into your database. And this could be, for example, the person's not allowed to opt into an email unless they've provided you an email. That's a really stupid check, but because their mailing software should check for that anyways. But in theory, we could create a trigger that says, if they inserted a record, they didn't provide an email address, why are they opting in? Now, where would you want to do this check? After you've written the file to the disk, the data to the disk, or before? You write it to the disk. Of course, you want to do it before because you want to make sure the data is clean going in and that the rules aren't being broken. Triggers allow database developers some really strong functionality to make sure that you don't have to deal with stupid programmers. Having done both sides of the equation, lots, as a programmer, I'm pretty lazy. Do I always put in all the use checks? No. Why? Because I put them in my database. Because I know when I'm designing a database that later on I'm going to forget to do this. If they give me a spec that's 300 pages long for an app that takes 3 days to write, right, I'm going to miss something. So you can use triggers to make sure that certain rules aren't broken. So I'm going to create a trigger, again with the same tables, where a person cannot opt into an email unless they provide an email address. So I'm going to start right from scratch again. Create function, or let's go create a replace, just make it easier. Function, email check, returns, trigger, as you can see, this pattern of this is pretty quick, right? It's the same every single time. Now, I'm still going to create an all-in-one trigger, just like I did last time. So that means I still want to do check what operation I just did. like such. So I'm going to do my insert first. I can go if new.email is not null, because assuming they didn't feed it in, or new.email, should be lowercase, not equal to empty. Actually, I'm going to go the other way around. Okay, so depending on how you write your trigger, halfway through writing this trigger, I realize I can write this without needing to check what operation this is. I'm going if the new email is either null or it's empty, and opt-out is true. So as you notice here, I'm creating a single condition using brackets. So this or this, either of these is true, and opt-out is also true. Then, actually, depending on how I want to look at it, opt-out is true. I'm going to cause a bug here, but I'm going to leave it because it's a logic bug for the moment. I'm going to raise an error. I'm going to get rid of this chunk off the top. Now, of course, the setter is kind of stupid. If I do a right tab, it's going to kill my code. And then I go return new, like this. All right. So you must provide an email address when opting in. And right now, logically, this is wrong. Can somebody tell me why it's wrong based on the rules I set? Yeah.
Doesn't that just do the message? It still allows it to do it, doesn't it?
No, raise exception kills it.
Oh, okay.
Raise exception is a kill command. Anybody here ever seen PHP, the die command? No. I don't know. What's the kill command in Java?
Break. Or return.
Break breaks your function. Return returns what you're doing. What happens if you want to execute and die?
Return does that. There's a different type of return.
Okay, good enough. Exception IO. So exception, right? No, my logic is wrong, because earlier I said if the person is opting in, therefore if the person opted out is true, that means they didn't opt in, right? They opted out. It's a logic issue. So if the person is not opting out, right? That's the problem with Boolean. Sometimes it's a negative state, so it's a double negative. They're opt out false. So I'm going to create my trigger, my function, and missed semicolon, and syntax error new returns. Hello. If and there's nothing wrong. Oh. Found. I'm missing some syntax. Single quotes. There we go. That's better. I'm going to copy this, put this over here, like this.
I'm going to create my trigger. Create trigger. Before insert on customers for each row. Like that. And I got it wrong. All right, so I'm going to insert into my customers again. Insert into customers. Name, comma, opt out. So this case, I'm going to insert a null into email.
Is that supposed to be,
Here's my error message I created earlier. You must provide an email address. So insert into customers, and I didn't provide it. Now, if I make this a true, it should allow it to happen because the condition, which was this, I'll bring back the trigger for a second.
supposed to be the other way around?
No. If they opt out, then they're allowed to go in without an email address because,
Oh, that was opting out?
yeah, because it's an opt-out. Opt-out means you're not receiving an email. So opt-out is true, means you don't want any email. That's what I was saying earlier about this double negative business, where opt-out is false. So this one is just for the inserts. You should do the same thing on the updates, and it's the same syntax as before. And go. And now if I were to go do an update customers, set email equal to for opt out false and go. Again, because I'm setting it to nothing, and I'm telling it I still want to receive the emails, it's not allowed. But if I did an opt-out like this, I can do this, and it's done. Now, there's two ways of handling what we just did, and that's one choice, which is essentially causing an exception. In other words, you broke the rules, thus you should not be allowed to do this. What happens if suddenly the programmers come back and say, no, you have to allow it to go in, but then you manipulate the data? The other choice we have is we could force the opt-out to be false instead. Instead of raising an exception, we could Houdini the data a little bit. And I know you guys haven't dealt with really big programs yet, but I don't know if you've ever experienced Houdini data, where data gets modified without you knowing what happened. It's sort of, how you have constructors for your classes, where as you define the class, you could actually use the constructor to modify the data. And unless you're actually aware that the constructor is modifying the data just got Houdini'd on you, or the data changed without knowing. We can actually change this whole procedure to make sure that instead of raising an exception and then breaking the application on the outside, we could enforce the rule. And this one here, we can enforce the rule by doing this instead. And we go new dot opt out. So what it's going to do is it's going to change the value of new. They opt out in new to be, opt out, so that if the person supplies an email address, it automatically opts them out. They can opt out all they want. They can't be opted out. Like they cannot be opted in, I should say. They cannot receive email unless they have an email address. The database server will force the change every single time to make sure it's valid. So you can use a trigger such as this to force data quality as opposed to just giving an error message and forcing the programmer to fix it. Because this happens, database was written so that the exception was there. During testing, nobody tested that condition. So dude wrote his little Java app, and he's all happy with how it works, but he never tested the combination of opting in for an email and not providing an email address. Why? Because QA sucks. He said, oh, this is good enough, we're done, out the door. And then it gets deployed. And a patch may take up to 5 or 6 days to be distributed. How long do you think the patch cycle is for Windows? Years, right? If they identify a critical bug in Windows, it can take several weeks to fix the bug. It goes through QA for a couple of weeks, then it gets added to the next patch Tuesday, and then it rolls on and on. So even a critical fix could take weeks to roll out to the desktop. On the other hand, you could write a trigger like this and fix the bug. Why? So that you don't write it as an exception. His code can't handle the fact that you raise an exception that it doesn't understand. Therefore, in that case, you change your trigger, you make it do something like this. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to grab a copy of this so that I've got a copy of version 2 for you guys. And I'm going to go back to my update like this. So if I go run that. All right, so dude is opted out. His email address is empty. I'm going to set this to false. And I'm going to run it. No error message now. However, if I do this, you can see it's still opted out. It forced it back to true every single time. Right? I made it false, but the email address is empty. It did this. There's ways of raising debug messages. So you can actually pass along a debug message to the other side so that at least dude can see any notices. It's called raise warning instead of raise exception. So you're raising a warning. It's non-fatal, but this is bad. We fixed it for you because you suck. And yes, I've written triggers like that. Let's say things like that to the programmers. There's no point to helping their emotions if they can't, follow the rules. Okay, so this is a basic set of examples. They handle, I've shown you 4 things today, and I'm just going to go over here so I can just stand while I discuss this. All right, so I covered 4 different things today. Well, like more than 4. And you'll probably want to rewatch this video, and that's why this video is going to be really short, so that you don't have to watch an hour-and-a-half video to get all the bits and pieces. And you get to enjoy all my typos again. I've showed you how to create a trigger function, right? In Postgres, you create a function in order to create a trigger. If you don't create the function, you can't create a trigger. Because of that, Postgres encourages code reuse. They'd rather you write a trigger that's 3 lines longer, as in you're checking which operation you're doing, so that rather than writing 2 separate triggers, because that means you only need to fix it in one place. For example, these 2 triggers that I wrote, these 2 trigger functions that I wrote, in MySQL that'd be 4 trigger functions, or 4 triggers, because the code's contained inside the trigger. There's a few other cute little tricks also with Postgres. This allows you to have multiple triggers per object. MySQL only allows you to have one. That means that let's say you got really complex business logic where you have trigger after trigger after trigger. Well, MySQL, you got to write one giant trigger. With Postgres, you could write a single trigger function that calls other trigger functions. You can execute other trigger functions. That's part of itself. I don't. The syntax escapes me off the top of my head. It's not something we do regularly, but it is possible to call one trigger from another trigger. That way, you can chain your triggers all together to make sure the rules are being maintained properly. I showed you guys how to do a logic check. Such as the if statement. For those of you that have seen the language called BASIC, that probably looks really familiar. Just putting it out there. That's basically a basic if statement. So I'm doing a logic check at the top, doing a second one in there, and I'm comparing the new to the old data that's being passed in. Because you have to rapidly check what operation it is, because when you're doing an insert, you don't have old. Old does not exist. Therefore, you'll get a fatal exception because you're trying to access an object that doesn't exist. Again, like Java, you have an object. You didn't instantiate the object, then you try to access a property of something that doesn't exist. What do you get? A fatal exception, usually, if I remember right. So we check to see if it's an update. We can, at that point, compare old to new. We do an insert. As you can see, we mix in some SQL in with our PostPL PGSQL because we can. The other example I did is I showed you guys how to manipulate the values and how to raise an exception. To raise exception, is like such. It's actually really straightforward. Mind you, one of the errors you saw when I was trying to build this earlier was that I was using the wrong quote marks. Why? Because in MySQL they're double quotes and Postgres they're single quotes. In Microsoft SQL Server, if you get to play with that ever in your career, it's single quotes if I recall properly, because C# behaves like C. Single quotes versus double quotes, they're not the same. I don't know how they behave in Java. If I remember right, they actually have different meaning. So same deal. Single quotes for strings, and that's how you raise the exception. So that if you have an error, a rule is not right, you can do that. And then the last example I did is manipulating the data before it gets written. If my rule is set and I can change the meaning of opt out and the new, which is good. You can do this for a lot of different purposes. You could use it to set dates, for example. Let's say at one point the database was created and there was no default set on a date field. So it wasn't set default to now, or default to yesterday, or default to 2 weeks from now. You can actually write a trigger to fix that issue. Or sometimes, if you flash back to the assignment 1 where I was talking about payment terms, net 30, right? That rings a bell, maybe for some of you. You can actually write a trigger to automatically set the due dates. For example, date sold is this, and then you could actually retrieve the payment term, saying it's 30 days. You could actually go now plus 30 days and set that as the new due date automatically. That means that the database controls it, not some crappy application. Because applications are weird. Some places, for example, the database is installed at GMT, date-wise, Greenwich Mean Time. In other words, the data, if I inserted data with dates in it and you're using GMT, it would actually be 4 hours, because we just fell back, right? It would be 4 hours in the future. So right now it's 3 o'clock. If I inserted data into a GMT database, it'd be inserted at 7 p.m. This allows your database to be global. because all the data going into the database is always at a set time. Thus, you can get the database to set the dates and times at all times, as opposed to getting the application to set it at date and time. So then you can actually set up all the reporting so that it uses GMT, so that at midnight in each time zone, you can actually tell, okay, I'll give you everything that belongs to me based on my time zone. And you can get the database to control that stuff. That is some of the purposes of triggers. You can write very complex business logic. Next week's examples, for example, are going to be more complex. But I wanted to give you guys all the bits and pieces. Essentially, next week you won't see anything other than this except for a completely cohesive example. And essentially, the next week's example will give you guys the basics of the basic idea of it. It's a inventory allocation system. You know, you go to Amazon, they say you got 5 on sale, and you buy one, suddenly you go back, now there's 4 on sale, but it hasn't been shipped to you yet. That's inventory allocation. You can do it all using triggers. All right, so preview of the timeline coming down the pipes after this week. I just need to pull up my calendar for a second. So we have 2 more lectures. Is that right? Yeah, 2 more lectures. Next week will be the second little bit on triggers. And then the week after that is review for the exam. I may switch it, just giving you a heads up now. I may decide to do the review next week. So you have 2 weeks to prep for the written exam, which might be more fair considering, you know, you're doing your practical. And then the week after that, I'll just do whatever. I'll do one or the other. I'll let you guys know by email which one I'm doing. Don't forget to do the test. Yeah, I've heard a couple of snickers. Do you know how many I've received out of the 2 sections? 7 emails saying I forgot to do the test. Even though I wrote it on the board. Right, this is the first year I've actually ever done this, writing everything before I start my lecture, so it's recorded. So that somebody can watch the recording and see immediately what's due. So, no, this is due. Starts at 4. You haven't done end of day Wednesday, it means midnight Wednesday. And when I stop talking, I'm going to go double check those dates, so please don't run up to me right away, so I can make sure I don't make a mistake on the times. Because, you know, Blackboard's a little funny with the dates and times every once in a while. The drop dead date is next Monday. As of Monday, you will no longer be able to see the test at all. But I've said, apparently there's a feature in Blackboard I was just told about recently. I learn something all the time too. That I can now get Blackboard to show you guys what your answers were after it goes away and disappears. So after you're no longer able to start the test, then it'll show you the answers. So for test 2, that's just going to come up. And I'm going to go fix test 1 so it's set the same way now. So you should be able to see your answers for test 1. Yeah. If you haven't done assignment 2, you know, by tonight, because the second half of assignment 2 is pretty much what the practical exam looks like. Just putting it out there. If you haven't done it, please try to do it. At least nothing else, you'll have a really good idea what you're getting into. Other than that, I'm going to pull the plug early because this is enough for one day. We've actually literally hit everything we're supposed to cover now. What's it for? When is it or what is it? Next week.